They humiliated her in front of a full cabin because of the color of her skin, and they thought they'd get away with it. A black woman, calm, composed, quietly seated in first class, asked for something simple, a drink, a moment of dignity. Instead, she was denied, mocked, and then publicly moved to the back of the plane like she didn't belong. No silence, and a look that said she'd seen it all before. But what the crew didn't know was that this time, they picked the wrong woman. What happened next would unravel everything they thought they controlled. This isn't just about a flight. It's about what happens when power is abused, when prejudice hides behind protocol, and when a system forgets who it's really dealing with. Stay through the end, because one detail changes everything. Trust us, if you believe respect isn't earned by status but by humanity. Subscribe to follow every twist. And drop a comment, what would you have done if you saw this happen? And where in the world are you watching from? Mavis Langley stepped onto Flight 214 with quiet purpose. Her back was straight, despite her age, her steps firm but measured. She wore slacks, a navy blouse, and low-heeled shoes, her gray curls tucked neatly beneath a simple travel hat. The first-class section gleamed with soft leather seats and brushed gold fixtures, a cocoon of luxury for those who expected comfort without question. Mavis moved through the narrow aisle, her ticket already in hand. She was in seat 2A. When she reached the front of the cabin, the lead flight attendant greeted her. Rebecca Sloan, mid-40s, hair pinned back tightly, offered a smile that had nothing behind it. It was a smile crafted for checklists, not people. Mavis held out her boarding pass and Rebecca scanned it. The green beep confirmed everything was in order, but Rebecca paused, just slightly. Just long enough to reveal a flicker of disapproval before she gestured toward the seat. Mavis returned a polite nod and sat, placing her bag beneath the seat and pulling a book from her coat pocket. She looked around the cabin, observing rather than engaging. The man next to her didn't acknowledge her presence. A couple behind her were already sipping champagne. A younger woman in 1C scrolled through her phone, never once glancing up. It didn't matter. Mavis didn't need validation. She had earned her place in this seat. She opened her book and began reading. As the plane taxied, flight attendants moved through the aisles, checking belts and bins. Rebecca passed again, this time with her gaze firmly fixed on her checklist, ignoring Mavis entirely. After takeoff, as the plane leveled out, service began. Drinks were offered in low voices, snacks handed out with careful choreography. When the cart neared her row, Mavis quietly closed her book and looked up. Rebecca paused. Mavis asked softly for ginger ale. Rebecca nodded, but didn't respond verbally. The cart moved on. Mavis waited, calmly, her hands resting on the cover of her book, eyes following Rebecca's efficient path down the aisle. 10 minutes passed, glasses clinked, passengers sipped, crunched, and nodded with satisfaction. The man in 2B received whiskey on ice within moments of asking. The woman in 3A asked for lemon with her water and got it in seconds. Still, nothing came for Mavis. She waited 5 minutes longer, then looked up again as Rebecca passed. "Pardon me," she said. "I believe my drink was missed." Rebecca stopped, her voice polite but hollow. "We're out of ginger ale," she said, then moved away. Mavis blinked. She glanced one row ahead and watched as a man was just then handed a can of ginger ale, fresh from the galley. No apology, no explanation. Mavis didn't speak. She reached into her purse and removed a small notepad, scribbling something slowly. Then she closed it and placed it beside her book. She returned her gaze to the page, reading again as if nothing had happened. But something had shifted in her posture, subtle but resolute. Rebecca didn't look back. She resumed service with robotic grace, her tone unchanged for the rest of the passengers. But her expression tightened each time she passed 2A. To her, something about Mavis's presence disrupted the order. She had expected someone like Mavis to be grateful, invisible, apologetic for occupying space she didn't seem to belong in. Instead, Mavis had made a simple request and asked for it twice. She had stayed composed when dismissed. That calmness, unbothered and dignified, was what irritated Rebecca most. It was easier to manage passengers who lost their temper. But the quiet ones, the ones who watched everything, those were harder to control. Those made her uneasy. Mavis didn't raise her voice. She didn't call the button. She didn't need. Across the aisle, another passenger watched in silence. A middle-aged man in business casual with a laptop open. He'd noticed the skipped drink, the second denial, the tension that passed like static in the air. He watched Rebecca avoid Mavis's gaze, saw the way her steps changed near row 2. He didn't say anything. But he tapped a note into his phone. 2A. Twice denied. Logged. Then he returned to his emails, but his eyes flicked up now and again, waiting to see what would happen next. Mavis, meanwhile, marked a line in her book with her finger and closed it softly. She leaned back in her seat, her gaze level with the window, her breath slow and steady. She had spent a lifetime recognizing these moments, the quiet theft of respect, wrapped in professionalism, only the same courtesy offered to those around her. A courtesy now being freely poured 2 rows back. A passenger in 4B, white, mid-40s, asked for ginger ale with a twist of lime. Rebecca delivered it in less than 60 seconds, laughing at something he said, her tone light and sparkling like the ice cubes through their reflection through the reflection in the window. There was no mistaking. This wasn't an oversight. It was a pattern. Her requests weren't inconvenient. Her presence was. That was the difference. The man, next to her, 2B, hadn't spoken since boarding, but now leaned over to activate the service button above. He hadn't noticed Mavis's previous exchanges. When Rebecca returned, she greeted him with a wide smile. "Would you like something to drink, sir?" He asked for hot coffee. She promised to bring it shortly, then said, "And she's still waiting on her ginger ale, by the way." For a beat, silence hung between them. Rebecca's smile faltered. "We ran out," she said, tight-lipped, before turning away. The man glanced at Mavis, puzzled. "That's strange. I thought I saw her bring some back there." Mavis offered a tired smile. "You saw correctly." She didn't say more. She didn't need to. Rebecca returned several minutes later with his coffee. There was no mention of Mavis, no apology, no attempt at reconciliation, just steam rising from a fresh cup and a pair of eyes that refused to meet hers. Turbulence began to rock the plane gently, a slow, rhythmic tremor that settled into the bones. The service cart disappeared. Passengers fastened seatbelts. Rebecca moved down the aisle, checking trays, resting hands lightly on shoulders, smiling like nothing had happened. Mavis remained silent, her tray folded neatly, hands still. Then came the voice overhead. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've encountered a patch of light turbulence. Please remain seated until further notice." Mavis recognized the voice. Calm, rehearsed, mailed. The announcement passed like a breeze. But her silence had finally become too loud to ignore. Rebecca returned, her voice hushed. "Is there anything else I can assist you with, ma'am?" Mavis responded quietly. "Only if your kindness works for everyone." Rebecca didn't reply. Her jaw tightened, and she walked away. Mavis didn't expect service anymore, only clarity. And she'd just received it. An hour into the flight, Mavis pressed the service button. This time it wasn't Rebecca who arrived. A different attendant, new to the route, leaned in gently. "Yes, ma'am?" Mavis asked to speak with the captain. Not to make a scene, not to escalate, but because she knew what this really was. The attendant blinked, startled. "I can check," she said, and vanished toward the cockpit. Several minutes passed. Rebecca returned, her expression measured. "I understand you requested to speak with the captain. Is there a problem?" Mavis's voice didn't rise. "I simply want clarity, that's all." Rebecca's lips pressed together. "Our captain is managing flight operations at the moment. I'll let him know your concern." Mavis nodded. "I'll wait." It was not a threat, it was a promise. 10 minutes later, the cockpit door opened. A tall man in uniform stepped into the cabin. Salt and pepper hair, pilot's bars gleaming on each shoulder. His name badge read, Calloway. "Is there something I can assist you with?" His tone was firm, practiced. Mavis turned in her seat to face him directly. "I've observed selective service during this flight. I made a request twice. I was overlooked. Others received what I asked for moments later. Captain Calloway looked to Rebecca, who stood just behind him. He paused. Then, instead of addressing her point, he said, "I'm sure it wasn't intentional. There's no need to make assumptions." Mavis didn't flinch. "I'm not assuming. I'm observing." Webster nodded once, clearly uncomfortable. "We'll be landing in 2 hours. Please enjoy the rest of your flight." With that, he turned and walked away. Rebecca lingered for a moment, then followed. Neither said another word to her. Mavis sat back in her seat, exhaling slowly. The captain hadn't listened. He had responded. But listening was different. Listening required attention, acknowledgement, empathy, none of which had been offered. Her complaint was treated like a distraction, something to be endured, then dismissed. The man in 2B looked over. "That was pretty clear," he said quietly. Riley leaned slightly forward, caught Rebecca mid-pass, and said clearly, "Excuse me, I couldn't help but notice. Why was this passenger denied service that others received?" Her tone was calm but direct. Rebecca paused, eyes narrowing as if weighing the risk. "Crew decisions with other passengers," she replied curtly. "Then maybe the passenger deserves an answer," Riley said, louder this time. Several heads turned. The hum of conversation dulled. Rebecca's jaw tensed. "Ma'am," she said to Riley, "please return to your business. If you continue to disrupt the cabin, we'll be forced to take further steps." Mavis turned her head slightly, meeting Riley's eyes with a quiet glance that conveyed both gratitude and warning. She had seen this before, how people who spoke up could become collateral. Riley's mouth tightened, but she sank back into her seat. Rebecca walked briskly down the aisle, disappearing behind the curtain at the front of the cabin. Moments later, the intercom chimed. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to remind all passengers to remain respectful and refrain from interfering with flight operations." The voice was male, corporate, vaguely threatening. Riley looked stunned. "Did they just call me out over the speaker?" she whispered to no one. The man beside her shrugged, eyes fixed forward. Her heart had begun to race. When someone defended her, they were silenced. When she defended herself, she was ignored. The structure of the injustice wasn't accidental. It was polished, rehearsed, and executed in plain sight. 20 minutes passed. Mavis kept her head down. Riley stared at her tray, her fingers twitching to type but resisting the impulse. Then came the second wave. Rebecca returned, this time flanked by a taller male attendant with a clipped expression and military posture. He knelt beside Mavis's seat, voice low and controlled. "Ma'am, we've received multiple complaints that you've been disruptive to the crew." Mavis looked at him, her expression unreadable. "I've been seated the entire time," the man continued. "We're going to ask you to move to the back of the cabin. It's a matter of passenger comfort and safety." There was no room for negotiation in his tone. Riley half rose from her seat. "This is ridiculous," she said. "She hasn't done anything. Further disruptions may lead to your removal upon landing." Around them, whispers spread like wild. "Did you see what she did?" "Nothing. She was just sitting there." "I think this is about something else." Mavis slowly gathered her things, movements precise, deliberate. She stood without help, holding her book and notepad, and stepped into the aisle. Rebecca gestured toward the rear cabin. Mavis followed without a word. As she walked, passengers stared, some curious, some indifferent, a few ashamed. It was the same walk she'd made decades ago, in protests, in school corridors, in courtrooms, every time someone tried to reduce her to less than she was. When she reached the rear of the plane, Rebecca indicated a seat near the restroom, wedged between a wall and the service galley. "Please remain here for the rest of the flight," she said. Mavis sat down, placed her book on her lap and adjusted her coat. The seat was tight. The smell of disinfectant and metal clung to the air. Her legs barely had room to stretch. Her body ached. But her back stayed straight. She had given up her seat, but not her ground, not her dignity, not her truth. The younger attendant passed by a few minutes later, saw her seated there, and hesitated. "Can I get you anything?" she whispered. Mavis looked up, eyes weary. "No, thank you." The girl nodded and left, guilt trailing behind her like perfume. In the front of the plane, Riley opened her laptop and began typing furiously. She had avoided it before. Now she couldn't. The story was writing itself. A woman removed from her paid seat, a witness reprimanded, and a company pretending nothing had happened. "This is your headline," she muttered. "Same sky, different treatment." In the back, Mavis wrote in her notepad again. A name, a time, a brief summary. Just in case. She had always known how to document, not for revenge, for accountability. The cabin shifted again. People settled into indifference, but the moment wouldn't vanish. From the cockpit, Captain Calloway made another announcement. "We'll be beginning our descent into Miami shortly. Please return to your seats and ensure tray tables are stowed." Mavis didn't need to be told. She was already anchored. As the plane tilted slightly, the motion reminded her of balance, how easily it could be lost, and how hard it was to regain. It's always about how they've been wronged. The words weren't loud, but they didn't need to be. Mavis heard none of it from her seat near the restroom, but the stares that occasionally landed on her came from that poisoned stream. A woman in 5C shook her head slowly and whispered, "It's entitlement, that's what it is." A sense of persecution where there is none. Another, passenger younger wearing noise-canceling headphones around his neck, added, "I mean, she got moved, big deal. People get moved all the time. It's not about race, it's about attitude." No one noticed Riley still typing, her eyes colder now, her hands faster. Rebecca stood near the galley, refilling a water pitcher, her jaw clenched. Danny, hovering nearby, glanced toward the back of the plane. "She's just sitting there," Danny said, almost a whisper. "Hasn't moved once." Rebecca didn't look up. "People like her know how to play the long game," she said, voice low, laced with irritation. "Make it about something it's not. That's how they work." Danny hesitated, her brow creasing slightly. "You think she did this on purpose?" Rebecca turned, her face tight. "I think she knew she'd get attention, maybe even compensation. The smart ones do. They book discount seats, make noise, wait for someone to slip up." Danny didn't respond. Her silence stretched too long to be neutral. Rebecca poured and placed the pitcher down harder than necessary. "She's not the victim here," she said sharply. "He's just louder about it than the rest." At the front of the cabin, a white-hailed man leaned toward a flight attendant and spoke with forced nonchalance. "You're handling it well," he said. "Not everyone could be so composed with situations like that." The attendant, Grace, offered a polite smile and nodded. "Thank you, sir. We try to maintain consistency." He nodded. "Sickert's maintenance. First class should feel like first class." The words sounded complimentary, but Grace felt the weight beneath them. She returned to her tasks, unsure whether she'd just been praised or warned. Meanwhile, a college-aged woman whispered to her boyfriend, "She probably pulled the race card. They always do when they don't get what they want." Her boyfriend shrugged. "Well, it's working. Everyone's talking about her now." And that was the truth. The back of the plane had become a spotlight. Mavis hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. But every eye that drifted back there wasn't wondering why. They were deciding what they already believed. The scent of coffee drifted through the cabin, mingling with the subtle bitterness of judgment. The pilot's voice returned briefly, another weather update, another reminder to prepare for landing. But even his calm baritone couldn't smooth over the ripples. In the galley, Rebecca glanced toward the rear, speaking softly to another attendant. "It's ironic," she said, "how they demand respect but never offer it back. I've worked 20 years to get here, and she, what? Shows up, takes offense, and suddenly everyone's on edge?" Victoria attendant nodded slowly. "They think presence equals power." Rebecca smirked. "No, they think presence equals immunity. But I don't bend because someone expects me to." Her voice dropped further. "And she's not the first. Won't be the." Neither of them noticed that Riley had stood from her seat. She was walking toward the restroom, not because she needed it, but because she needed to see Mavis for herself. What she saw made her stop. Mavis sat perfectly still, her notebook balanced on her knee, her pen uncapped but untouched. Her eyes were half closed, not in sleep, but in control. She wasn't slumped. She wasn't bitter. She was bracing herself. "May I sit here?" she asked. "May I sit here?" she asked. Mavis opened her eyes and looked at her. She didn't answer immediately. Then, softly, "She already did more than enough." Riley shook her head. I didn't. The silence between them was fragile but not empty. Finally, Mavis spoke. They're rewriting the moment while it's still happening. Riley nodded. Not if I write it first. Mavis didn't smile, but something in her expression shifted. A fraction softer. Then write it right, she said, and whispered. Always. A passenger across the aisle watched them, confused, then turned away, uninterested. The story had moved on for most, but not for them. As landing began, the fasten seatbelt sign lit again. Passengers adjusted their seats, placed devices away, buckled in. In the rear, Mavis stared out the window. Clouds peeled away as the ground came into view, sprawling and sunlit. She had been dismissed, degraded, and humiliated, yet her dignity remained. Around her, people traded glances like luggage, but she had brought something else. She would carry this moment, sharpen it, and when the time came, she would decide how to use it. As the landing announcement ended and flight attendants began their final sweep of the cabin, Mavis reached into her handbag and removed her ticket sleeve. She unfolded the document slowly, then raised her hand. Danny arrived with cautious steps. Yes, ma'am? Mavis looked at her directly. I'd like to speak with a representative from corporate upon landing, not a supervisor. Corporate? Danny blinked. I don't think that's something we can arrange. Mavis remained steady. Then connect me with someone who can. I won't be silenced twice in one day. Danny hesitated. Rebecca, overhearing, appeared behind her with the practiced calm of someone already forming a rebuttal. That's not possible, ma'am. Corporate doesn't interface directly with passengers in transit. You can submit a complaint through our website. Mavis didn't move. Then I'll do it from the terminal, but I will speak to someone. Rebecca's eyes narrowed. Your complaint will be noted, she said. Her tone was clipped, polite, rehearsed. Designed not to inform, but to dismiss. As Rebecca turned, she reached for the boarding pass, still resting in Mavis's hand. We don't need this anymore, she said, and without waiting for consent, tore the corner stub from the top of the ticket. Mavis watched as the fragment fluttered into a small trash bag Rebecca carried. That document belongs to me, Mavis said softly. Not once it's processed, just protocol. Mavis exhaled once, slow and silent. Riley, still nearby, typed the moment word for word. Danny's face twisted with hesitation. Is that normal? She asked quietly as they walked away. It's efficient, Rebecca replied, not looking back. In first class, another passenger raised a glass and said, Glad that's finally handled. His neighbor agreed. Whole flight was tense. Don't know why she had to make it a thing, but the tension hadn't ended. It had only been pushed lower, beneath layers of protocol and polished lies. As the plane began its final descent, Mavis sat alone at the back, eyes locked forward, not blinking. Her hands rested on the notebook in her lap, the torn ticket tucked inside like evidence. Riley remained just across the aisle, her expression unreadable. You still want to speak with corporate? She asked. Mavis gave a slow nod. It's not about what they'll say, it's about what they'll have to record. Riley nodded. When we land, I'll walk with you. From the front of the cabin, Rebecca called for passengers to return tray tables and seatbacks. Her voice was smooth, commanding, completely devoid of the unease that had been buried just beneath it minutes earlier. She'd delivered many landings. This one, she assumed, would be no different, but something in her stance betrayed the truth. She was waiting for the flight to be over, not because of schedule, but because she'd underestimated who she'd moved to the back of the plane. The landing gear extended with a low thud. The plane tilted and straightened as the city came into view. Mavis placed her notebook back in her bag and zipped it shut with care. Every motion was deliberate now. She'd let them choose how to treat her, but she would choose how to respond. When the wheels struck the tarmac and the cabin shifted forward in unison, she kept her balance without reaching for support. Passengers around her exhaled and stretched, their minds already moving ahead to baggage claims and meetings. But for Mavis, the landing wasn't a conclusion, it was a threshold. A transition. A reckoning. Rebecca stepped out from the galley and began issuing instructions, her smile back in place. Please remain seated until the captain turns off the seatbelt sign. Her voice floated across the rows like a rehearsed curtain call, but Mavis wasn't waiting for permission anymore. She was waiting for the moment to stand it. As the aircraft rolled to a stop, the chime sounded and seatbelts latched like dominoes. Passengers sprang to their feet. Luggage was pulled from compartments. The smell of stale air and perfume mixed in the aisle. Rebecca moved to the front exit with Grace beside her, preparing their final goodbyes. Danny lingered near the galley, eyes fixed on the rear. Mavis stood slowly. She didn't rush. Riley stepped beside her, offering no words, just presence. As they approached the aisle, a man from business class caught Mavis's eye. "Hey," he said, barely audible. "Sorry for earlier." Mavis nodded once. No anger, no invitation, just acknowledgement. Mavis stood still, just inside the exit, waiting for space to clear, her posture unshaken. Rebecca, by the forward galley, lifted the cabin phone to her ear and began to speak softly. Moments later, the cabin speaker cracked with static before the captain's voice filtered through, this time with an edge no longer disguised. "Ladies and gentlemen, before you deplane, we must address a situation from earlier in the flight. Our crew experienced difficulties with a non-compliant passenger during service, and we ask for your cooperation in respecting our team's safety protocol." The statement was careful but coded. He never said her name. He didn't have to. Heads turned toward the back. The implication was clear. The woman they had watched moved, dismissed, silenced, was now being labeled disruptive. Riley's eyes widened. He just said that. Out loud. Her voice was low, stunned. Mavis didn't blink. She'd heard such warnings before, from courtrooms, from podiums wrapped in power. Not direct accusations, but announcements veiled in polite poison. A woman from row 7 whispered, "I knew it." She looked like trouble. Another nodded. They handled her gently, all things considered, and just like that, the judgment became justification. It wasn't about what had happened. It was about who people already believed she was. Danny, now near the galley, overheard two passengers laughing quietly. One said, "Some people just don't know how to fly first class." The other replied, "They want the luxury but not the rules." Danny flinched. Her eyes drifted to Mavis, who stood still, dignified, unreadable. Rebecca leaned over and whispered, "Just let it go. This kind of thing always circles back on itself." Dan didn't answer. She only watched. And remembered. In the concourse just outside the plane, two uniformed gate agents waited near the boarding counter. One held a clipboard, the other had a tablet flashing alerts. Rebecca approached them first, offering a brief summary. Words like escalated, uncooperative, refused to comply. None of it false, but none of it full. When Mavis stepped into the walkway, one of the agents smiled tightly. "Excuse me, ma'am, we'd like to speak with you briefly." Riley stepped forward immediately. "She's not alone." The agent hesitated. "We just need a moment of her time." Mavis nodded. "If it's recorded, I'll speak." The agent raised a brow. "Recorded?" Mavis repeated, "I have no interest in unofficial words from unofficial voices." Her tone was calm, her words deliberate. Passengers behind them stared. Some paused, some walked faster. The whisper of scandal had made its way into the terminal. One woman snapped a photo. Another muttered, "She brought this on herself." Mavis stood in the center of a ring of silence. Inside the crew's debrief room, Rebecca relayed her version to a supervisor, a woman in a blazer with silver pins and a badge marked Service Oversight. "The passenger became combative when we couldn't accommodate her beverage request," Rebecca said. "She refused seat instructions and involved another guest unnecessarily." The supervisor listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally. When Rebecca mentioned Riley's interference, the supervisor asked, "Did the secondary passenger become aggressive?" "Not physically," Rebecca admitted, "but emotionally invested, which compromised service consistency." Supervisor tapped her notes. "Any recording or written complaint yet?" "Not yet," Rebecca said, "but I expect one." The supervisor glanced at her screen. "Then write a preliminary incident summary before the report escalates." Rebecca nodded. "Of course." Behind her, Danny lingered, her hands folded. "Do we file together?" she asked. Rebecca paused. "Only if asked." Danny looked down. "Right," she whispered. Her voice had grown smaller during the flight. At the baggage claim, Mavis stood beside Riley, silent. Her carry-on rested beside her feet, her phone untouched, her posture precise. Around her, passengers pointed, some whispering, others pretending not to see. A man with a business magazine leaned toward a colleague. "She'll file a lawsuit, that's what they do. Squeeze out a settlement and vanish." His friend nodded. "Or post it online." Riley overheard them and stepped closer to Mavis. "We don't have to be quiet," she said. Mavis shook her head. "Not yet." "Why?" Riley asked. "Because," Mavis answered, "when people rush to defend themselves, they reveal what they're trying to hide." A child nearby asked his mother, "Why are they looking at that lady?" The woman replied, "Because sometimes people don't know their place." Mavis turned slightly at the words but said nothing. The world had always told her where her place was. She had simply chosen never to stay there. Rebecca exited the terminal via the staff door, clutching her clipboard. She looked composed, her lipstick untouched, her stride firm, but her shoulders were tense. In her pocket, her phone buzzed. A message from her supervisor read, "We'll monitor social, be ready to respond." Rebecca typed back, "It's contained." She didn't record anything. A second later, another buzz. A forwarded link from an anonymous handle. A photo of Mavis standing quietly in the aisle, accompanied by the caption, "Moved for asking for ginger ale." Already climbing in shares, already being noticed. Rebecca stopped walking. For the first time that day, she didn't have a response. Behind her, the terminal echoed with the sound of rolling suitcases, boarding announcements, and stories already mutating into legend. The photo she had uploaded now had thousands of views. A growing tide of people were demanding context, details, and accountability. Yet Mavis did not react. She pulled out her own phone, not to read headlines but to send a message. Her thumb hovered, then tapped a contact labeled simply Jordan. The text she sent was brief, activating. A second later, her phone buzzed with a single reply. Confirmed. Then she dialed a number she had memorized decades ago. Her voice was measured. "This is Mavis Langley. Authorization code Delta 47. Internal review request. Emergency clause invoked. Full sweep. Start with flown to insurgent." She ended the call and placed the phone calmly back into her coat pocket. Several gates away, a man in a slim-cut suit stood against a column, watching the crowds. His name was Jordan Langley, early 40s, sharp-eyed, and well-known across aviation regulatory networks as a silent enforcer, someone who moved quietly but whose presence often marked the beginning of drastic change. He had received the message from Mavis as the plane was still taxiing, "Mom's on 214. The message read, humiliating her. That was all he needed. He walked toward the security terminal without breaking pace. His ID badge didn't say FAA, but it outranked most. He didn't need clearance. Clearance. At the operations center, he pulled up footage, documents, manifests. In minutes, the entire service log from Flight 214 appeared before him. Audio clips, shift rosters, digital timestamps. He opened a secure line and began recording. "This is Langley, documenting escalation on 214. Subject M. Langley. Flight staff under review. Begin suspension protocol." Back at the terminal, Mavis remained unnoticed by the agents who'd spoken to her earlier. But now, something had changed in the way staff were moving. Calls were being made, names were being confirmed. Uniforms grew stiffer. A gate manager received a quiet directive in her earpiece and froze mid-sentence. "Effective immediately," the voice said. "Ground hold on Flight 214 crew. No departures, no transfers. Await senior review." The manager turned pale. She looked across the concourse and spotted Rebecca exiting a staff corridor. "Rebecca Sloan?" she called. Rebecca turned. "Yes." The manager motioned her over. "You need to remain in the terminal. Corporate's called a compliance hold." "A what?" Rebecca blinked. "We've done nothing wrong?" The manager didn't argue. "Just wait in the conference office." Danny approached from the far side, noticed the shift, and asked quietly. Rebecca replied, "Some's being stirred up, some overreaction." But her hands trembled slightly as she said it. "Your baggage claim." Riley looked at Mavis. "What did you just do?" Mavis didn't answer directly. "I submitted a request," she said, "for clarity." Riley's eyes widened. "Clarity doesn't cause a flight crew to be grounded." Mavis gave a faint smile. "I'm talking spies." She turned her eyes toward the terminal's glass wall, watching clockwork. Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. "This wasn't the first time." but it might be the last one they handle like that. At that moment, Jordan entered the terminal floor, now walking with 2 federal inspectors in plain clothes. They moved efficiently, pulling data from encrypted tablets, scanning names, identifying crew. One of them nodded toward Rebecca and whispered, "That's her." Rebecca saw them and stepped back instinctively. "What's this about?" she demanded. The taller inspector said, "Official inquiry. You're listed under an expedited review code." She opened her mouth to object but found no words. Grace, the younger attendant, stood nearby, confused. Danny looked to her. "They said expedited review," she whispered. Grace's eyes darted toward Rebecca. "Is that real?" "It is now," Danny replied. Rebecca was pulled aside. Her voice carried through the hallway. "This is her representation." Jordan stepped forward finally. "You'll get it. But first you'll get investigated." He turned to the others. "Secure. Footage. All cabin recordings. I want audio from takeoff to touchdown, and check for suppressed passenger complaints." The inspectors nodded and moved. A supervisor approached Jordan with wide eyes. "Why now?" Jordan didn't answer. He simply held up his phone. On it, a frozen frame. But it wasn't just the image, it was the name. Once her full identity was confirmed, the panic began. Mavis Langley, co-founder of the original SkyWest Legal Consortium, former human rights attorney, and the woman responsible for 3 of the most precedent-setting federal discrimination lawsuits in aviation history. The room fell silent when a compliance officer said, "She was on our plane." A lawyer asked, "Why didn't anyone recognize her?" Another replied, "Because she didn't want them to." The CEO rubbed his temple and said, "She didn't make noise, she made a record." The head of PR looked down at her phone and whispered, "We're bleeding shares by the minute." In a matter of hours, social media platforms were flooded with the clip. Passengers had recorded the moment she was relocated, the tone in Rebecca's voice, the way others looked away. Riley's post alone had been shared 60,000 times. Underneath were comments like, "This isn't just racism, this is systemic erasure," and "How many times do we miss who we're really mistreating?" Mavis didn't respond to any. She was already in a private room near the terminal, seated with federal agents and aviation regulators. She provided a single-page written statement, no theatrics. "I'm not interested in apologies," she said, "only in structural correction." Jordan, standing beside her, added, "And full policy review across 3 divisions." The lead investigator looked up from his notes and asked, "You're not suing?" Mavis shook her head. "Not yet. But if this fades without change, you'll see my name on the docket. Again." The weight of that, "again," landed hard, because they all knew her record was undefeated. At a press conference hastily arranged by the airline, the CEO appeared flanked by spokespeople, reading from a printed page. "We deeply regret the treatment of Ms. Langley aboard our flight. Her contributions to this industry are profound and enduring. The actions taken by crew members do not reflect our values." Reporters pounced. One shouted, "If she hadn't been who she is, would you still regret it?" Another asked, "What's her seat worth to you now?" The CEO stumbled, then pivoted. "We are conducting a comprehensive review." But the message was already out of his hands. That night, major news outlets ran the story nationwide. Editorials titled, "The Woman They Tried to Vanish," and "When You Silence the Powerful Quietly," headlined front pages. Business analysts reported a $1.8 billion drop in shareholder confidence. One anchor put it bluntly, "She didn't need to speak. Her silence cost them everything." The damage was no longer about money. It was about the lie that had been exposed. Behind closed doors, internal records were being audited, emails flagged, staff histories examined. Rebecca was now under formal disciplinary review. Her conduct, already recorded, was reviewed second by second. Her dismissal of the drink request, the tone she used when addressing Mavis, the way she spoke to other crew. A corporate investigator asked, "Did you know who she was?" Rebecca shook her head. "No, she didn't say." "Would it have mattered?" the investigator asked. Rebecca hesitated. Then, with a dry laugh, "It would have mattered to you." The silence in the room afterward was absolute. Dan, when questioned, told the truth. "I didn't know what we were doing felt wrong." When asked why she didn't intervene, her answer was simple, "Because I was afraid of being next." Her words were added to the official report, filed under culture of compliance via fear. Mavis, meanwhile, had already left the airport through a side exit, avoiding cameras. She didn't want to be a symbol. She wanted to be a reminder. In the car ride back to her residence, she kept the window cracked, letting air cut through the quiet. Riley sat beside her, exhausted but alert. "You changed everything," she said. Mavis responded, "No, I revealed what was already broken." Riley nodded slowly. "Now they see it." Mavis's phone buzzed again, messages from other lawyers, former clients, advocacy organizations. Requests for statements, endorsements, she ignored them all. "They want a soundbite," she said. Rebecca Sloan arrived at the staff entrance and found her ID denied. The red light blinked. Security approached. "You've been removed from the schedule," they said. "You need to report upstairs." She didn't argue. The silence in the elevator to human resources was colder than the press storm. Rebecca read the words twice, then let the paper rest on her lap. "What happens now?" she asked. The HR officer said, "Now, you cooperate or you litigate." Danny received her own summons, though hers was framed differently. She was told she would be part of a compliance audit. Her responses would determine whether she remained with the company. In her interview, she admitted her discomfort. "I felt what was happening was wrong," she said, "but I didn't know how to stop it." "Not directly," Danny replied, "but I knew silence was rewarded and challenge was punished." Her words were entered into an internal ethics report titled "Passive Complicity and Organizational Pressure." Meanwhile, in a conference room with 4 lawyers and 2 compliance officers, the CEO of the airline gave a press statement. He did not read from a script. "It was about our failure to see, to listen, to respect." He paused. "Emma's Langley should never have had to experience what she did, and none of us should have allowed it." The microphones captured every syllable. Outside corporate headquarters, protests began forming. Not massive, but meaningful. Employees held signs reading, "Accountability at 30,000 feet," and "We are all passengers." News vans lined the block. A former employee posted a video stating, "This wasn't a rogue crew, this was culture." More testimonials followed. Stories of microaggressions, ignored complaints, a system that prioritized brand over people. Shareholders demanded change. Government regulators called for a formal review. 3 board members resigned. 1 week later, a sweeping announcement was made. The airline would launch a mandatory recertification program for every employee above supervisor level. This program would be led in part by a third-party advocacy group for civil equity and overseen by an advisory panel chaired by Mavis Langley herself. She didn't seek the role. They offered it. She accepted under one condition. "This won't be optics. It will be transformation." Her voice, quiet but unshaken, became the new tone of policy moving forward. Rebecca remained mostly silent during the fallout. Her lawyer advised her to avoid interviews, but that didn't stop the press from circling. A photo of her seated alone on a bench. When asked what she would say, she responded, "That I was doing my job, that I followed procedure, that I wasn't trying to hurt anyone." The lawyer didn't reply. Later, during deposition, when shown the video of her ignoring Mavis, her face changed. Not in panic, but in recognition. She whispered, "I didn't think it looked like that." "What did you think it looked like?" Rebecca didn't answer. Her silence echoed louder than any denial. For Danny, the review ended differently. She was given a choice: remain in a reduced role with a mentor, or exit the company with full benefits. She chose to stay. Her first assignment was shadowing a new equity training program. On the first day, she sat in the back, watching a former passenger give a lecture on implicit bias. It wasn't Mavis, but it could have been, as the presenter spoke about how harm rarely feels like harm to those who deliver it. Danny's eyes welled. She wrote one sentence in her notebook: "Being silent is a choice. So is changing." Back at Mavis's home, the phone rang almost constantly. Universities, law firms, think tanks, all requesting input, collaboration, leadership. She turned down most. That quote became the closing line on every major news segment that week. Within 30 days, the airline began restructuring its entire employee hierarchy. 37 employees across multiple departments were reassigned, disciplined, or released. New training protocols were implemented. Quarterly evaluations now included equity performance metrics, and for the first time in its history, the airline published its full bias audit publicly. The public response was mixed, some skeptical, others cautiously hopeful. But few could deny that in an industry where image ruled over substance, this time the change wasn't for show, it was for survival. Rebecca watched the coverage from a quiet room. Her name was no longer trending, but the legacy of her actions lingered like smoke. 3 weeks had passed since the headlines faded, since public outrage gave way to the next scandal, the next viral moment. But for those at the center, the weight had not lifted. Rebecca Sloan sat on a weathered park bench in the shade of a maple tree, her hands resting over a folded letter she had rewritten 6 times. Her hair was pulled back loosely, makeup absent, posture deflated. She had lost her position, her pension eligibility, and any illusions she once carried about how the world worked, or how she had worked within it. In her lap was an envelope addressed to Mavis Langley. It was not a legal response or an appeal. It was a request. A request for something she had never known how to ask for: understanding. When she finally stood and entered the small brick building adjacent to the library, the address on the back of the envelope, she didn't know if she'd be allowed to speak, but she knew she needed to try. Inside, the space was quiet but alive. Walls lined with books, bulletin boards filled with flyers titled things like restorative practices, civic dignity training, and unlearning by listening. It was not an office, not a courtroom, not a place of punishment, but something else. A room built for re-entry. At the reception table sat a young woman with warm eyes who looked up and said, "Are you here for the circle?" Rebecca nodded. "I'm not registered." The woman smiled. "You don't need to be." She handed Rebecca a form and gestured to a semicircle of chairs already half-filled. People sat quietly, some anxious, some calm. In the far corner, Mavis Langley was pouring tea into a ceramic mug. Her presence, even here, was exact. When she finally turned and saw Rebecca, she didn't blink. She simply nodded once and said, "Take a seat." Rebecca obeyed. The session began without introductions. Only one rule was spoken. What's said here stays here. What's owned here changes out there. When Rebecca spoke, it wasn't defensive. She didn't excuse. "I thought I was doing my job," she said. "I followed procedure. But procedure was built by people who never had to sit in the seat I forced someone out of." Her voice cracked. "I was afraid to lose control, so I punished the person who made me feel out of control. I made her the problem so I didn't have to face my own." Silence followed. Then Mavis spoke. "What you felt wasn't control. It was proximity to power. The kind that disappears the moment someone stronger stands up. And I wasn't stronger because of who I am. I was stronger because I didn't run from what I've seen." The group was silent again, not because of tension but reverence. Then a man across the circle said, "This is the first time I've ever heard someone admit what silence costs other people." The session continued. No applause, no conclusion, just breath between stories. Afterward, Rebecca remained seated while others left. Mavis walked over and sat beside her. "You came," she said. Rebecca nodded. "I couldn't forget." Mavis asked, "What is it you want from me?" Rebecca exhaled. "Not forgiveness, just a path." Mavis was quiet for a long time, then she opened her folder and handed Rebecca a pamphlet titled Witness and Repair. It was a training series, not corporate, not formal, but personal. It focused on historical context, interpersonal accountability, and community reconstruction. Rebecca scanned the front. "Can I start now?" Mavis smiled, not kindly but firmly. "You already did." Weeks later, Rebecca began volunteering at a local advocacy library. She coordinated events, sorted cases, learned names she once ignored. She didn't speak about her past publicly, but when asked why she started, she said, "Because I was giving something I didn't deserve, a second chance, and I didn't want to waste it." Riley, now a columnist, published a final piece titled After the Noise: What Justice Looks Like When No One's Watching. It focused not on Mavis, but the people who came back, who showed up, who chose discomfort over defensiveness. The article went modestly viral. A community group in Minneapolis requested reprint rights. A university invited her to teach, but she declined. "This isn't a class," she said. "It's a commitment." She still met Mavis for tea once a week. No interviews, no microphones, just quiet. Mavis herself had returned to a slower rhythm, consulting only part-time, refusing all awards. When a journalist asked if she was proud of how it ended, she replied, "It hasn't ended, but it's beginning to grow in the right direction." Then she smiled and added, "Justice isn't a show. It's a seed." And those listening, those truly listening, heard the meaning in every word. Elsewhere, others began coming forward. Former employees, passengers, even executives who once turned away now asked how to join, how to repair, how to relearn. Not all were accepted, not all were ready, but those who were willing to listen, truly listen, found a space, waiting. And that space, built on patience rather than punishment, became something powerful. It became a mirror, and in it, people began to see themselves not as who they had been, but as who they could become, if given a reason, if given a chance, if given the truth. Mavis never raised her voice. She never asked for pity. She never even demanded an apology. She just sat still long enough for the world to see itself and decide whether to change in the end. If this story moved you, take a moment to like and subscribe so you won't miss what comes next. Which moment hit you the hardest? Was it the silence, the shift, or the final reckoning? Tell us your thoughts in the comments and let us know where in the world you're watching from. Your voice adds power to the message. Let's keep this conversation going.